Here's me at the Old North Church in north part of Boston. It's the oldest congregation in Boston and is the longest continuous religious congregation in the U.S. The Old North Church was made famous by the Longfellow poem. Longfellow being an abolitionist, he focused on writing a poem that created patriotic and unionist themes that would help in his era of the pre-Civil War. The poem created the myth of Paul Revere's Ride. It's interesting that in reality, the myth of Paul Revere's Ride doesn't really line up with reality. The 30 or so riders that carried the message to the colonial militias weren't even in Boston. They were across the river. It was great to see where the signaling lamps were shown in the steeple of the church, and it was neat to understand how much the two men that accomplished the signaling, how much they had risked. It was great to see that in terms of minorities and alternative narratives, the tour guide really focused on presenting these as a major part of the presentation. He focused on the way the seating in the church until after World War II was segregated, with the left balcony reserved for the African Americans without needing to pay to enter. Also, it was interesting that the tour guide discussed how slavery paid for the establishment of the Old North Church, and how the plantation owners who funded the building of the Old North Church had made their fortunes in Honduras using slavery to accomplish it. The final minority group that the tour guide focused on was the Loyalist majority congregation and how this reflected the wealth of the congregation. So basically, to get a pew, or what's called the box pew, you paid a year's wage for a common worker. And this reflected the wealth of the congregation and the extent, the wealth and the success that the Loyalists, the British Crown, had enjoyed prior to the American Civil Revolution. But I'd say the best part of the trip, honestly, was the chocolate. The church has a chocolate shop with a reenactment group that discusses how chocolate was made in the colonies and performs demonstrations of how chocolate in the colonial times was made, and discusses how the different elements of chocolate were brought over from Latin America to the colonies, and how it's not the same as chocolate in Europe, how they still use much the same recipes as those used in Latin America. And overall, the trip was probably a success. It's important to note that at the Old North Church, the signaling with lamps was probably one of the most significant events in Boston, and the two men who had signaled from the church's steeple barely scraped away, getting away from the British soldiers who were trying to figure out what the